Greetings to everyone that's online. I'm Margaret Scott with the New York Southeast Asia Network, and we're very pleased to have today's event called The Coup in the Camp. But first, I want to thank our New York Southeast Asia Network coordinator, Sri Coup, for putting this event together. And I want to ask everybody that's online to please become a member of the New York Southeast Asia Network. We're doing a lot of interesting things, and you can subscribe to the newsletter. Also, just to let anyone who's available to go up to Columbia today at 6, and it's also a hybrid event. It's the Center for Khmer Studies Introduction to their work. Today at 6 at 918 room 918 in the International Affairs Building. So now I'm going to turn to, thank you very much. Elliott Prasse-Freeman is with us today, and it's extremely interesting. His expertise is both on history and politics in Myanmar, but he also has been spending a fair amount of time doing field work in Bazar with the Rohingya refugee camps, in the camps. He was just there just a couple of days before that tragic fire in February or March, February. So he had just been there. But more importantly, he has a book coming out, and I have had the pleasure of having listening to him talk over the years, and I can't wait to see his book, which is going to be out in September. Rights Refused: Grassroots Activism and State Violence in Myanmar, the Stanford University Press, and it's based on work that he's been doing in Myanmar from 2004 2021, and he really does know a great deal. And it has a wonderful way of weaving in history into the contemporary fabric of what's going on and why. And he also has a book project in progress on Rohingya political subjectivity amidst the dislocation and mass violence. And I should also say that he's a professor, assistant professor in sociology and anthropology at the National University of Singapore. So we're going to have, he's got a PowerPoint, which will be very interesting, and then we're going to open it to Q&A. So, and there will be this chat box on the Zoom. Elliott, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Margaret. It's always nice to be back here, and this might be the third time I've spoken at the network. I hope more times to come. It's a really kind introduction, and today's talk actually is going to weave together or try to connect the two projects that Margaret mentioned. The first one that is on sort of the work that the research I've done in Myanmar proper, and I'm going to talk about that in the context of the tragic coup or attempted coup, we might say, that occurred in February 1st of 2021, and then look at it in the context or from the perspective of the camp, the refugee camp in Bazar that Margaret mentioned, but also other places that Rohingya have fled to over the last 50 years, really, and how they see their belonging in the country or not. So I'm going to start by telling a story about the coup and how Myanmar people are trying to rethink some of their political commitments and maybe prejudices, and then talk about how it's affected the Rohingya. Okay, so in the aftermath of the coup, Myanmar people were really furious about the disruption of, at that point, this transition to democracy, however flawed it was. But what was really kind of impressive and maybe unexpected were the amount of documents seen on the streets that essentially address the issue of inter-ethnic solidarity or lack thereof. And so there are a lot of messages that talk not just about we want democracy back, but we want something that's different than what we had before. So the sign up there on the left, the Burmese and the English basically say something similar, which is that we are Bamar people, and Bamar are the sort of majority. They probably constitute between 60 and 70% of the population of the country, but they're not only against totalitarianism, but they're demanding federalism. And in the Burmese, it says Bama Lunyoji Wada, which is, or Wada, which is the sort of like Burmese chauvinism, and that's what they're opposing. But there was also sort of a suggestion that because of the way the coup occurred, the democratic forces in the lowlands would need the ethnics. So it wasn't just necessarily a pivot for the right reasons. And this is a handwritten note from Minko Nine, who's one of the famous 1988 leaders, and he's involved in one of the political parties now. And so here he writes, essentially beg the ethnics. You can actually see in English the word ethnic written there. And so what people were asking online, what exactly does that mean to beg us? And one Chin interlocutor of mine said, well, when things are okay for you, you'll forget about us again, just like the battle days. So there is a tension that emerges about what kind of cross-ethnic solidarity could be forged. Nonetheless, there is a sort of conventional wisdom that the coup has made the Bamar, the Lumyo being the word for like race or ethnicity, realize some things. That the Sitat, the military coming after them has made them realize that the Sitat has been doing the same thing to other Dainentha, which is the Burmese word for like, literally means sons of the soil, sort of indigenous people, and even including Rohingya and other Muslims. Made them realize that Burmanization must be addressed for true federalism, peace, and democracy to be achieved. And the action that it's calling for is that there may be some stragglers, there may be some reactionaries, but we must uproot Burmanization. So on a certain level, this is really heartening because there are a lot of problems with the transition and the way that it essentially sidelined ethnic issues. And so there was a chance here to find a silver lining in the coup that at least some of these issues would be addressed. But then the question is, what exactly is Burmanization and how could it be addressed? And so I started to kind of dig into the discourse and see what do people mean when they use this term. And so I kind of adduced from a lot of things that I was reading in Burmese language and English, two sort of different definitions that dovetail to a certain extent. One would be like direct domination, and one would be more like indirect, the sort of cunning of regulation and governmentality that we could say that makes people essentially lose their ethnicity. It incentivizes them to give up their native language to become Bamar. My adduced definition is that Burmanization was to transform by either direct force or by cunning or without any intention at all, non-Bama people into Bama and non-Bama spaces and histories into Bama ones. So this is an assimilative, absorptive project within limits though. And in fact, Rohingya might stand as the constitutive outside, the sort of people who can't be assimilated in, because they don't look enough or act enough like the people who are pretty close to us, our cousins or our brothers who just happen to live in Maryland and speak a little bit differently. So there's a desire here to transform through incorporation. It's a sort of colonial concept, we're reaching out and absorbing. So how does this, what does this look like? This is a picture of a Sunday school, or sorry, a Buddhist school in Chin State designed to like forcibly or coercively convert Chin people to Buddhism. So there were these Buddhist missions, especially during the 90s and 2000s, called Damden, Dapanapyu, sort of making Buddhism the sort of de facto state religion, publicly patronizing Buddhism, and not so publicly, but definitely supporting extremist Buddhist organizations like Bazar. They passed these pretty odious race protection and promotion laws, 4 laws, and I can't remember if they're passed in 2014 or 15, that basically made intermarriage more difficult, conversion more difficult, etc. There was an argument here that local languages were effectively eliminated by prohibiting their use either directly or indirectly in schools, and then sort of physically colonizing spaces. So in Rakhine State, there, when Rohingya were being, not even when they were being kicked out, but when they were being forced into their own villages, there was this program by the immigration department to take prisoners out of Yangon and resettle them in these areas and even give them cows so that they can occupy Rohingya spaces. And then, of course, the most egregious version of this would be ethnic cleansing or genocide, which we saw play out, of course, in 2017 in northern Rakhine State. But you can make an argument that there were similar kinds of projects occurring Eastern Burma and Northern Burma, like Kachin and Karen will make that argument as well. Now, what is the other kind of Burmanization? So this is a more subtle thing that's going on. So this is we might call it like symbolic reterritorialization. So it's a fancy way of saying replacing ethnic symbols with Bamar ones. So there was a famous case in Mon State and Kaya State in which there were statues of General Aung San, and there was a bridge of Aung San rather than locally resident idioms. There's, you can say, miscegenation, the objectification and desire of quote unquote light-skinned Danyenta women as particularly desirable. And then there's a sort of single ancestry discourse that's promoted that eliminates difference, because we're all basically the same at heart. Now, of course, you could argue that's a good thing, but from the perspective of ethnic folks who don't want their histories to be elided and their people to be erased, it seems like a sort of destructive project. And this kind of presumes a sort of state centrality. If for the cunning of governmentality to work, you have to have governmentality. In other words, for people to give up their language, they have to be in a context where using Burmese is relevant. And so that's kind of an open question, because there hasn't been a lot of really good or much at all ethnographic work on what it's like to live outside of Burma spaces and in the place like Pukao or something like that in China. I'm sorry, in Kachin State. Now, as I was trying to figure out some of this discourse, I was asking my Burmese friends about it. And one of them said, it's hard to see.
Yeah, we could get rid of the.
Yeah.
And then we could move.
I don't really need to see. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So my friend said to me in March last year, well, there can't be Burmanization because we Bamar like the white-skinned Danyenta girls. So the first thought I had was, well, according to the definition that I had of Burmanization, this seems like a perfect example, right? That miscegenation and a assimilative absorption. So that definition of Burmanization had clearly come from academic literature and NGO activists. And in the definition was that it works through systems like law and language, making everyone have to conform to Bamar. This example seemed to conform to that definition, but the speaker claimed the opposite. The speaker was saying that Burmanization doesn't exist because of these type of practices. So this is a sort of moment that an anthropologist gets all excited because he starts to figure out that something that's operating in one language might be operating differently in another language. And so I was suspicious about this term Burmanization. I wanted to know how it was translated into the vernacular. What were people actually using in Burmese language, and how could that have created a situation where I say one thing and he hears another? So it meant here that the vernacular, or the local understanding of Burmanization may be different than it existed in the academic literature or in the NGO sphere. And so I said, okay, now I really want to know more about this expression. So given that there are many takes on the topic, my research team started to realize that we were finding something new. And then we did fieldwork to drill down in less public settings than Facebook, was sort of like informant or interlocutor interviews focusing on the divergent meanings and how those impact interpretation of this ongoing debate about what it means to contest urbanization. So let's get into the way. Let's see what this is. So we started to ask, what are the Burmese language terms for what's going on here? And we found that there were at least 3 different terms that people were using. So the one on the top says Bamar Ji Wada, and the one in the middle says Bamar Pu Chin. You can see that one here in this graphic. So kind of like found it in the wild, so to speak. And then the last one is Burmanization. So that's a sort of English loan word. And that's, it's funny, but it also kind of suggests that maybe this word started in English and came back into Burmese. And that's always, it's not disqualifying it being important or interesting. It just means that there are different epistemic communities who are using these terms. And so there can be class and racial issues about how these terms are being deployed, and people might be missing each other. Okay, so let's take a look at what these mean. So Bamar Ji Wada, Lumyo means race, Ji means big or great, and Wada is like Islam or ideology. So this is the ideology of the great race, basically. And here it's the Bamar being the great race. And so the structure of domination, or the structure of engagement, is one of sort of distance and difference. We are above you, you are below. We don't want our people to mix because we would never adulterate our blood by mixing it with people like you. That's one kind of connotation of Bama Munyuchiwa. Now, Bama Mupyu Chin, however, using this wonderful Burmese verb pu, which means to like transform, is this one that came more from the sort of academic discourse. This is the assimilation through force or cunning or accident. And that Burmanization, I wasn't sure really what it meant. So one thing I want to stress here is that there seem to be maybe not opposites, and certainly that you can have both at once, but at least a situation in which there's different things going on here. One is like, come, we will absorb you, you'll be assimilated. And the other one is like, stand back, we will always be above you. So I kind of call this as the different structures of domination, assimilative versus exclusionary. Now, I want to suggest there might be risks in not specifying Burmanization specific contours. So I started to think about how these, or our research team started thinking about how these terms might affect different sub-communities in the country. In the sense that people might be literally talking past each other. So for an elite NGO worker, Burmanization seems to exist as it's been described in academic discourse as sort of complete, hegemonic, dominant, encompassing the entire country and working subtly through institutions. Now, that presupposes a couple of things: homogeneous state control and institutional relevance in everyday lives. Those to me are open questions. Now for Nyata, and I'll talk about it a little bit about who these folks are, but they're sort of like the heartlanders of Burma. They haven't participated much in revolutions of the past. They tend to think of themselves as the sort of salt of the earth people who end up getting not a whole lot of privileges in the country. So when they hear Burmanization and Burmese privilege, they feel quite attacked. In a way, and I don't want to like draw metaphors that introduce more problems than they benefit from. John is smiling here because he kind of knows where I'm going to go. This to me feels like almost like an aggrieved whiteness discourse in America, right? People feeling that the sort of woke discourses of racial justice miss the way that they've been excluded. And I do encourage us to think about connections to other places because the phenomena are quite similar. Now, for a elite Imam state who won't let his daughter marry a poor Anyata migrant from his way, Burmanization doesn't seem to describe his situation much at all. For a Shami, which is what I would call double minority, so a minority within a minority district, so a minority living in Kachin state, Burmanization misses the point entirely because it's Jingpo or Kachin domination that's relevant to the Shami. And then for South Asians, and this is where we'll come back to Rohingya, the problem is not Burmanization, but colorism and religious bigotry that matters. Okay, so let's take either of these one-on-one. For the elite NGO member, it seems they believe that sort of recognizing their privilege and apology are sufficient rather than addressing more like structural concerns. There's a sort of concern that while many may be hopeful and while there may be many hopeful and courageous new solidarities spoken about at this revolutionary moment, going back to what I alluded to at the very start of the talk, which was, when things are okay, you'll forget us again, from the chin interlocutor, talk might prove cheap, right? So let's actually change some structures of distribution of resources that might really address these things. In other words, it's difficult for Bama discourse of apology and recognition of privilege to credibly commit to a future politics of solidarity and equality. Maybe I'm being a little bit ahead of myself, but let's, oh yeah, I already mentioned that. But let's go into the specific experiences of the different groups. So if you look at this map, that's the central area, sometimes called the dry zone, sometimes called Anya, which means upriver in Burmese, is the regions of Magway, Mandalay region, and Sagaing. And what's unique about this particular moment is these folks have never really participated much in national politics. Even the uprisings of the past, the Anya people basically sat that out. But this time they're leading the front of it and probably dying most disproportionate numbers Yeah, and so one of the big
Percentage of the
questions.
population, sorry to interrupt. Would you
Okay.
say that we have to-
Well, I would say they're, probably like 8 to 10% of the population.
Thank you, so.
No worries. So like, big area, not particularly dense because they don't have many cities besides Mandalay. And people who are, they tend to be not as landless as what was going on in the rest of, the landlessness that was really quite prevalent in Ayawadi, for instance. And as a result, and this is something I've been trying to figure out, why are the Anyata so involved in the revolution? Suggests, at least from vulgar Marxists like myself, that there must have been something good about the revolution, I'm sorry, the transitional period, which as a vulgar Marxist who thought the transition period is pretty much like a domination of global and regional capital and inscription of people into these new circuits of exploitation was, something that was, challenging my priors, but something that's hopefully not a complete ideologue I do want to continue to think about. And I think it had something to do with the fact that if you had land, if you owned the means of production, and during the military period, you were just subject to lots of coercion and abuse, removing some of that allowed you to benefit from what you had. But this is very preliminary. People like Mary Callahan and Stefan Ford are two scholars who spent a lot more time there than I haven't, my research was here, but I wasn't living in those areas like they have done. So I expect, and if they're out there listening to this, I hope that they will be writing wonderful books about the Anyata revolution soon. But anyway, if you can look at Anyata and Anyatu, which would be female Anya person, will describe their sort of exclusion as maybe not the same kind of exclusion that a Karen or a Kachin or a Chin person would feel, but kind of along the same line. So she says, even Anyata are discriminated in Yangon because of Anya accent. One of my friends was rejected in the interview for a presenter position at this media house. Those who are living in Yangon think the Anya accent is amusing. Not only Anya, they also feel the accent from Bay and Dawei a bit strange for them. But we, Anyata, are derided only for our dialect, whereas other ethnic groups are more discriminated against for their accents and usage when speaking Burmese. So here she's saying there's a sort of spectrum of exclusion, but it's worse for ethnic minorities, but we're still on it. And if we're not paying attention to class discrimination, we're missing like a vector of exclusion. And that's one of the kind of risks of identity politics is it allows elites to benefit and mobilize people who have more in common with other poor people and with that. But I'll loop back to that at the end. Apparently I'll loop back to it now. This is why the class critique brought by Anyata is so important. It sort of forces reconsideration of who is involved in this revolution. And so then rather than Bamar sort of as a group apologizing to Danyintha as a group, it suggests that poor Bamar and Danyintha, indigenous people, have more in common with one another than with elites or cronies in their own ethnic groups, potentially destabilizing the viability of those group identities, or at least elites' abilities to mobilize people through them, thereby upending old ways of doing politics. Oh, I've already been talking for a while, so I gotta get on with things. I talked about these already, so I'll skip through them for now, so I can get to the Rohingya issue. So I'll start with this. So finally, for the Rohingya and other Muslims, the risks of not specifying Burmanization's contours would end up creating a sort of object of concern or object of we need to get rid of this thing. It's not really going to help them. So in talking to a friend of mine recently, he described the necessity of rethinking what even constitutes the majority. So from his perspective, it is not Bamar, but all the Danyintha, the 135 official recognized races who enjoy that particular status. So rather than it being a situation of Bamar up here and everyone else down in the sort of hierarchy, and then Rohingya like clearly below, there he's kind of saying, well, it's all the Danyintha over here, and we're the ones who are really excluded. So this will let me pivot into the unique situation facing the Rohingya in the outline of the camp. And this part will be a lot more empirical. It will kind of just describe sort of the situation of the Rohingya since 2017 and then also since the coup. So we'll go a little bit over the ethnic cleansing or genocide, and then how the coup has impacted their struggles and how they think about what's going on, or what position they might occupy in a future growth. So to go over this will be old hat for many of us, but get everyone on the same page. In 2017, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, known as ARSA, pictured there with the guns, attacked security forces in northern Rakhine and killed approximately 100 people. The military responded with violence that was disproportionate. But first, who are we talking about? So ARSA, Saudi-funded, Pakistani-trained Rohingya emigres. So there are people who didn't spend much time in northern Rakhine State who were kind of machinating to instigate an uprising. ARSA plays a sort of ambiguous position in Rohingya society, because on one hand, they're responsible for all this violence and suffering. On the other hand, they were standing up for the Rohingya people. And so I think many people kind of feel ambivalent about it. The Myanmar military had been amassing forces in the area in advance of ARSA attack, kind of suggesting premeditation. And then there's some Rakhine Buddhist ethnic group, majority in Arakan State or Rakhine State, they also took part in the burning of villages. So the consequences were that the Myanmar military used ARSA according to terrorism to justify collective punishment. And as a result, 800,000 people fled, 11,000 were killed, and the military bulldozed the remains of villages in northern Rakhine State, nationalizing the land and making it difficult for Rohingya to return. So there is Rakhine State, and Cox's Bazar is the part of Chittagong in Bangladesh, where the people fled across the river Naf to the west. So I want to talk a little bit about what emerged in the camps early on after the extrusion, and then what was the situation when I returned a couple of weeks ago. And again, this is obviously subjective. It's only my particular perspective, and take it with that grain of salt. But I do want to stress that, at least from my perspective, there were huge differences in what the situation was like that I think have relevance for the politics going forward. So this is Ukiah there is the site of the largest, what's it called, refugee camp in the world. So about 1 million people probably living there. Only 800,000 were kicked out. So how do we get 1 million? Well, this is not the first time Rohingya have been forced to flee Myanmar. There were major ethnic cleansing in 1978 and 1992, 1994 as well. So it's never a good look to describe a refugee camp as a particularly uplifting and positive place. But in 2019, there was a sense of sort of, can't actually read that, of cultural revival going on in the camps. So in the context of destroyed life worlds and suffusion of Rohingya-ness with violence, what I mean by that is there was a sort of sense that the violence that they suffered had become the whole experience of what it meant to be Rohingya. In the camps, there were civil society organizations, poets, and artists who were able to say, well, here's a chance, we're no longer under the thumb of the military, to explore what it means to be our ethnic group. They became sort of laboratories for salvaging Rohingyas. And with all the messiness and problems that this might bring up, like who gets to speak for the community, what kind of institution truly define Rohingyas. But those, I think, debates are pretty healthy in one sense. So Mayu Ali, who is a poet who started the Rohingya Poetry Garden, wrote this article for The Independent, saying he sees a renaissance for my people in the camps. So the Rohingya leaders were building new institutions to keep memories of old ways of life alive. And Ali obviously calls this a cultural renaissance. But by 2023, so like February when I was back, unfortunate Bangladeshi politics and Burmese political events led to pretty tragic outcomes. So marginalization, including murder of progressive civil society members, securitization of camps and the rise of ARSA to like essentially kind of like put a stranglehold on what's going on in camp life. So how did this occur? So in 2019, Bangladesh wanted to find a sort of partner in repatriation. Sheikh Hasina, who was the prime minister, was pretty, she felt good about her magnanimous position towards the Rohingya, but did not want them living there forever. And the Rohingya became an easy scapegoat for populists who were opposing her. Why doesn't Sheikh Hasina do something about the Rohingya? They're bringing in drugs, they're undermining local labor markets because their labor is subsidized essentially by getting a food packet in the camps. They can afford to work for a tenth of the price of a local Bangladeshi. So these are like real issues that have beset other contexts around the world in which refugees are living amidst other political economies. So Bangladesh really wanted to find how can repatriation can happen? How will we convince Rohingya to go back? So there was a sort of contest in the camps for who could be this partner. And the Arakan Rohingya Society for Peace and Human Rights, ARSPH, had emerged as a really vocal civil society actor. Perhaps more vocal than active, it could be said, but it's okay. Now, this is a sort of unfortunate situation where you had one part of the Bangladeshi state kind of encouraging ARSPH to mobilize camp dwellers, demonstrating leadership, go out and do these things, and then you'll demonstrate that you're a viable partner to work with. And so in 2019, on the anniversary of the genocide, there was this huge rally in the camps in which thousands of Rohingya demonstrated. This was a major mistake, unfortunately. One part of the state was encouraging them to do this. The other part of the state was really unhappy about what happened. So Sheikh Hasina there is embarrassed and furious. I Googled Sheikh Hasina furious. That's the maddest picture. She just looks a little consternated. So it became a domestic political scandal of ungrateful refugees making demands that, you know, you should appreciate what you have. So she purges the people in charge of the camps who are really progressive. I heard one of them got sent to like the Department of like Jute dying, and that's not what you want to end up. That's not good for your career. Don't end up in that niche. So like really vindictive, like retributive and punitive. And she replaced them with sort of like paramilitary forces. And ARSA's leader was released from house arrest. ARSA becomes even more powerful in the camps. And the coup occurs, thus making the sort of civil society repatriation role mute, at least for now. The ARSPH head is murdered 6 months after the coup, and the rest of his the people who are close to him are resettled in Canada. So Mayu Ali, the gentleman who I mentioned earlier, is now in Canada. And this is not like a critique, but it does mean that as people are fleeing, people who are still left there are feeling even more abandoned. There is a sort of, and here's, I'm being quite speculative, trying to make sense of what's going on the ground. It seems like there's a de facto detente between the Bangladesh security forces and ARSA. I wouldn't say they're like actively working together, but and there's some weird things going on recently where there's a big fight between Rohingya Solidarity Organization and ARSA that led to this purge, like this elimination of a camp at a place called Zero Point, and the death of a Bangladeshi security force officer, which I think will lead to major consequences for ARSA, at least according to my security sector folks. But the point being is that they kind of like divvied up the camps to keep it a securitized space where it could also be a site for like extraction of rents. So you have lots of civil society organizations from the West wanting to support things, and ARSA says, we're happy to have you talk about human rights all you want, as long as you give us a cut and work under us. So civil society, those who are unwilling to do that, had to go underground and not be able to do the activities. And one of the many reasons why it was such a pretty unique place to visit. So here's the murder of Mobibullah. So that's the kind of situation going on now. How did the coup affect how Rohingya think about their position in the country? So as you might imagine, there were mixed feelings. Some people were like, you know, basically, I told you so. You know, you, Aung San Suu Kyi, made a deal with the devil, and now, you know, the tiger who you thought you had by the tail is turned back on you. Other people, and I think this is the my ULE quote, but I haven't been able to find it on Twitter since it was either taken down or so maybe I shouldn't attribute it to him anymore. But someone, Rohingya said, "My Burmese brothers and sisters, now our country needs us. All we need to pay is the third struggle. Last time we did in 1988, we know how to do it. Together we can do it again. This time the struggle should be the last one ever, the last one ever." So if you do a sort of like analysis of this text, he sort of is sitting on a fictive kinship relation, right? My brothers and sisters, and this is important for Rohingya who are continually seen as outside the realm of the polity. And he talks about how the Rohingya have been involved in these struggles in the past and will help in the present. They also convey that to their Burmese brethren that they're actually more like us, hyper marginalized Rohingya than you might think. Like, look, this happened to us in the past, so we're sympathetic. We don't bear any grudge that you weren't kinder to us. Now let's go together for the revolution. Weiwei New, who's another Rohingya activist who has been incredibly active for the last really 15 years. She had a similar kind of argument here. So the world has failed to stand with Myanmar. Despite this lack of support, I remain hopeful for my people's future, right? So basically, smuggling Rohingya into the broader civic nationalism of what it means to be Myanmar, which is, I think, very clever and certainly trying to rework political community in Myanmar after the coup. Okay, so that brings us to 2023. The camps are now covered in barbed wire. Most rooms are illegal. It's difficult for foreigners to get entry letters, even with connections. So foreigners, in this case being me, I didn't have any trouble getting to the camps in 2018-19, but now the same people who gave me a letter, they're like, no, we can't do that. It's too dangerous. It exposes us to risks that we can't accept. So like I had to sneak in, walking around checkpoints. But even when I got there, no one was willing to talk to me for fear of reprisal, because you don't want to be seen talking to a foreigner out in the open. Instead, those interlocutors who I wanted to meet with had to sneak out of the camp to talk to me. And so the brain and leadership drain is pretty intense as well, as anyone who with connections or marketable talent works for resettlement. Young people seeking no future risk death and torture from human traffickers in an attempt to flee the camps. So even though the refugee camps are supposed to be a place of refuge, literally in the name, people are fleeing to Malaysia, a place that doesn't have camps, that won't let you legally work, that won't allow you to access health services, but at least there are opportunities there for people to live. Okay, so then, and I'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. On February 1st, 2023, 2 years after the coup, I was there in the camps and I was meeting with the student unions and youth groups who identified themselves as working for human rights and who are now all underground now and doing pretty limited sort of educational activities that can be construed as like non-political and hence didn't rise to the level of extraction or repression by ARSA and similar groups. And I asked if they are, how are they marking this 2-year anniversary? And one of the folks said, we're not marking it at all because we want to go back to Rakhine State. The military is in charge, so we can't do anything to speak against them. So the desperation is so great, they're willing to work with the genocidaires because it's the only game in town. Moreover, as the current war between the American army and the Sitat rages in their backyard, repatriation is very dangerous. So between the military, the AA, and maybe even NUG, it's more ambiguous there. It's not clear if there really are any Rohingya allies. And this is where it gets kind of tricky for like international actors who have put a lot of pressure on the national unity government to say the right things about Rohingya. Because on one hand, it would be nice to see that. On the other hand, people often don't respond very well to that form of coercion. And one wonders whether it remains the level of rhetoric rather than getting like leading to actual change. Okay, so in conclusion, some upshots linking this sort of earlier talk about Burmanization to the Rohingya situation. So while Bamar is invoked, or Burmanization is invoked as sort of a central evil, which if addressed will rectify all ethnic problems, the existence of localized hierarchies and different kinds of exclusion. So bigotry against Muslims being greater than maybe discrimination against Danyantha and expressed through differential access to resources, both material and institutional, means that federalism can't just be a sort of blanket solution. It'll have to attend to those local power dynamics. So what kind of recommendations might do like a policy seminar? I think it's important to listen to non-elites. Elites have an incentive to align local difference, to say things like, all the Karen people think this, all the Bamar people think that. It doesn't mean necessarily that they're being cynical liars. They just see the world through their own lenses. And if you ask people on the ground, they might have different perspectives on the identifications that are important to them. They might not see themselves first as a Karen, for instance. And so the term related to this, the term intersectional, gets thrown around a lot these days, but I think it's really relevant for a place like Myanmar, just because people's class, gender, linguistic, really locational experiences. So living in an urban area, living in a rural one, living in a Bamar space, or living in an upland space will impact their identity as much as what it says on their national registration card, which is ethnicity. So I think this is important for the representational practices that occur in writing NGO reports and academic ones. So instead of just saying like, a Karen person says this, well, that's like only the start. You need to know how old is that Karen person? Are they what kind of Karen are they? Are they skull? Are they full? Where did they grow up? What class position are they in? All those issues will impact what they say. If not all Karen have the same experiences, but certainly not about their friends. And I use Karen as an example. And then finally, as ever, support radical class-based struggles that identify common enemies, sort of military capitalists across ethnic lines, and provide an opportunity to forge solidarities that stress common oppression exploitation rather than merely ethnic difference. If you want to hear more, I have a podcast with Stephen Campbell, the author of this great book on squatter settlements in downtown Yangon, where we talk about some of these issues. And we hope to not reduce everything in Myanmar to a class-based analysis, not to be, as I said earlier, vulgar Marxist, but to reintroduce a class element that has been, I think, surprisingly left out. One of the reasons being that the BSPP, the Burmese Socialist Program Party, kind of made talk about class kind of like not very popular because they co-opted Marxist discourse and turned it into an excuse for basically like kleptocracy. So it's hard to reintroduce class to Burmese people who don't want. They're like, no, that's what the BSPP did. We don't want that anymore. But I think if we in conversations that explain how it's relevant, using examples like Anyata don't have the same kind of Burman privilege than elite in Yangon, class can reemerge importantly. Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening to me.
That was extremely interesting. Thank you very much. Quite a very interesting. Just before we go to questions, I have a quick question. I know it's not too complicated to explain, but the young person in the camp that said on the anniversary, we can't say anything against the North because we want to go home.
Yeah.
Put my breath away, but I'm not an expert, so there's a lot I don't know. What is the status of repatriation? One from the Bangladesh side, 2 from the refugee camp side, and 3 from whether it is even possible.
Yeah. So what I've been told in conversations with people who know this sort of thing, it's kind of beyond my pay grade, is that there will be a symbolic sort of repatriation of probably like 100 to 1,000 people pretty soon. 100 to 1,000. Yeah. So obviously like a drop in the bucket in terms of what it would actually be needed, but I think that the Sheikh Hasina needs to show her political constituents that something is being done, and I think the regime wants to normalize itself vis-a-vis Bangladesh, and they essentially say, look, we'll take these people back, and that will make you look good, and then you will work with us, and that will make us look good. So it's a pretty cynical sort of thing, in which Rohingya, as they have since the 1960s, and even arguably before, but definitely since '78, being used as sort of political football pushed across the border in either direction. So that was that I think will happen. I think there's a surprising amount of support for it, given that and that reflects just how miserable the situation is in the camps. That people are like, you know, if we could die at any time from the military in Myanmar, but we could die any time here from, you know, armed people with guns and such. So we might as well try and might as well die in our homeland, which is pretty bleak. Was there anything else in there that I didn't address?
How realistic is it that repatriation will happen? Is there any interest in the revolution? It's hard to know.
Yeah, so that I'll answer that in a couple ways. One of the big questions is like, what does the Arakan army feel about Rohingya? On one hand, they've said, Tumrat Nine, the head of the Arakan army, has said some pretty progressive things about Rohingya, but on the other hand, and right now the Arakan army is remarkably successful compared to other, just given how short it's been in existence and how it's like going toe to toe with the Sit-Down and like, occupies a significant amount of Rakhine State. But they also have this ideology of the Rakita land, which means like the way of Rakhine. And there's a sort of suggestion, if you deconstruct what the way of Rakhine means, that yes, the Rakhine would be happy with the Rohingya, provided that they take a second class citizenship sort of status in like, we'll welcome you back as long as you're our servants. No, I don't want to say that's necessarily what will end up playing out in the way of Rakita, but I've definitely heard certain Rakhine ideologues express it that way. So that's just one sort of thing. And then the question is, like, would the military take back 800,000 Rohingya? I don't think so, given that they were the ones responsible for forcing them out.
Sydney Jones has a question, and it's something that I also wanted to hear more about. So can you say more about the RSO? Has it experienced a resurgence? What are the differences in goals or ideology with RSF? And who else claims to represent Rohingya in the camp?
Great question. This is very much beyond my pay grade. I know very little about the RSO, but what I do know, or what little I do know, I can talk a little bit about, and that is that it was an organization that had sort of ascent and it's like its most relevance in the 70s and 80s, I think. And so the RSO, as I understand it now, is sort of RSO in name only, and just becomes a group of other violent political entrepreneurs who have been essentially hired by the Bangladeshi state to contest ARSA. And so it's almost like they're paramilitary, the Bangladeshi's paramilitary. The question about who speaks for the Rohingya, there was like ARSPH and Mohibullah, I think maybe always claimed much more representation than he perhaps already had. Not to speak ill of the deceased, of course. But I mean, it was understandable that he was trying to mobilize a bunch of people, and it was kind of like a fake it till you make it kind of approach. But to answer your question, that since the displacement of his group through his murder and the settlement of his family and other people connected to him, there is really a pretty significant vacuum in terms of people representing the Rohingya community. There are a lot of Rohingya in the diaspora who speak for, or at least about the Rohingya community, but there's a sort of question about how much legitimacy do they have, given that they haven't been in the camps or experienced violence in 2017. And that speaks to the sort of this issue of Rohingya-ness, in which the experiences of violence have been so central, and then living in Rakhine State is so fundamental that if you don't do either one of those things, it's hard to claim credibly that you can speak for the group.
Before we get to Eric White's question, I just want to have a question that leads to outside the camps. In the camps, you couldn't understand how civil society groups and artists were marginalized and how artists seemed to have gained prominence. Who was driving that? What was the engine behind that shift?
Yeah. So I don't have a great answer for this, because if I'm Arsa, why do I care if some artists are expressing themselves? I think it had something to do with this wrangling for who was going to be the partner to the Bangladeshi state. And if you look at it that way, then it makes more sense that the Arsa would want to monopolize all cultural expression under its umbrella. We are the representative of the Rohingya, and look, we have a cultural element, and we have a religious element, and we have a political element. The other issue is that Arsa is, and again, I do want to stress that I'm not an Arsa expert. A lot of this is speculation pieced together from people who know more about it than I do. But it seems like there's like Arsa local and Arsa central. Arsa central, a little bit more political, is on Twitter, talks about ideology. Arsa local can be as little as political entrepreneur who wants to run an extraction racket at the local level, who claims he is Arsa in order to mobilize the threat that comes with that, right? So you have these two different scales, and it's quite possible that, like, people talk a lot about like fake Arsa, right? People who just claim to be Arsa in order to say, oh, that you got a nice shop there, it'd be a shame if something happened to it, kind of thing. But yeah, I still don't have a great answer for why civil society was so aggressively throttled, but it was quite striking when I returned, and it was a totally different place than when I visited before COVID.
If anybody in the Q&A has some ideas on this, we'd be more than happy to entertain them. But I'm going to turn to Eric White's question. Your talk focused on the Rohingya in the Bangladeshi refugee camps. But what about the Rohingya who did not flee to Bangladesh and remain inside Myanmar? How was the anti-coup discourse, their inter-ethnic solidarity, differentially addressed or grappled with these two distinct communities of Rohingya? Sorry, my eyesight's bad. Are they equally conceptualized as members of an idealized future national community? And if so, by which groups or organizations?
Yeah, great question. So there's kind of like Rohingya who are still in Yangon, which is one of the largest city, and who live in, there are certain communities in Yangon, Dangyang and Boda Town, for instance, which tend to be seen as Muslim communities. And many Rohingya will raise their children in these communities, not telling them that they are Rohingya, because telling your children that they're Rohingya exposes them to risk that is just not safe in a country like Myanmar. It's bad. It's dangerous enough to be a Muslim. But what did happen after the coup, and perhaps, Eric, you saw this, is there were people on the streets holding out signs saying, you know, I am Rohingya and I am against the coup, which was striking not for that support, but for the willingness for people to go on the streets and self-identify in that way. And there were some really, as you put it, moments of really powerful interethnic solidarity with Myanmar or Burmese people, non-Rohingya people holding signs that said, we're sorry about what happened to the Rohingya, and we realize that a future can't go forward with. Now, those Rohingya speak Burmese, and I think there's a sort of feeling that the Rohingya in northern Rakhine State who don't speak Burmese but speak mostly Rohingya language, perhaps are less a part of the nation. And so that part, which gets to your question about two distinct communities, I think that probably will be an ongoing issue about to what extent can the Rohingya be seen as like a part of Myanmar. I don't think that there should be any problems, given that the Rohingya suffered with the other Burmese people in the past and are willing to work for a common future. But those are the questions that need to be worked out quickly.
So, anybody in the room, if you have a question, we have another question from our online audience, Sue Wong, also interested in the situation in refugee camps in Thailand. Can you share a bit about your experience there, if any? Thanks so much.
Sure. So I've never worked in the in the refugee camps in Thailand. The Rohingya community there is entirely integrated into the local society, to the extent that maybe integrated is the wrong word, but merges into the local society. So Mesat, which is this border town that was the site of much sort of opposition to the regime during the years 1980 until 2011, has kind of re-emerged as an important place there for the opposition, but it's also has long been a site for a really large Muslim community, of which many Rohingya have been there for a long time. And I was talking to a colleague of mine who works who's a Rohingya person who works for the Thai with the Thai government to do translation for people Rohingya who get caught up in detention centers. But there are people fleeing from the camps. Most of them get to Malaysia, but many of them are trying to get to Thailand as well. And there are probably 100 people per day, which adds up over time. The other issue with the refugee camps in Thailand is that during the transition period, there was a lot of what's called aid flight. The idea that the funders were like, okay, this camp is no longer necessary. Your country is back on the right track. And so there's sort of like liquidation of some of the camps, and as money went to other places. Now, given what has happened since the coup, the fact that there are tens of thousands of internally displaced people who may come across the border, I'm not sure exactly what the conditions are in the camps or whether funding will return to that.
Yeah. If we don't have, we do have another question. Great. How do you read NUG's Rohingya policy? It was being criticized as not sufficient by many Rohingya. Any possibility that the federal charter of the NUG addressed the rights of Rohingyas? How do you read that?
Yeah, good question. I haven't actually looked at it closely enough to comment on it with any sort of insight. So I won't speculate on it here just because I would be speaking without any knowledge.
And just generally overall, could you comment on what you've read about and witnessed of the NUG so far? Do you think that the chances that the people who say when everything's fine, we'll forget about us, is going to probably be true? Or do you think this is a new dispensation, and how, which way would you go and why?
Yeah.
Or in between, take a binary.
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the, the problems is that the NUG includes people like Bunya and I can't remember her name. There's another woman who have said some pretty horrible things about Rohingya in the past. And Bunya, I believe that has apologized for it in part response to Burmese netizens who kind of like said, look, we need to make this right. And then the NUG has been criticized for being like a little bit too much like the NLD, but it does have more ethnic minority representation than the NLD certainly had in the past, arguably. So I guess it's kind of easy to condemn and critique the NUG, and I think it does warrant critique along certain lines, but I also think that it's facing a number of challenges, and so I wonder if they spent a lot of time trying to mobilize like support and legitimacy from the quote unquote international community, but I wonder what the ultimate end game is there, and maybe they could be spending a little bit more time articulating their messages to Myanmar people about what that future politics, what that future is.
The relationship between the NUG and the ethnic groups. I mean, even as you say, neither trust goes back a long way. Are they working together now? Are they working with some of them?
Yeah, there's a lot of actors in the mix. So in one sense, the NUG is trying to claim it represents the PDFs, the People's Defense Forces, which are these sort of local defense forces that have emerged to try to protect local communities and fight against against the regime. There is some amount of infighting within those PDFs and a sort of lack of command control on the part of the NUG. So the NUG wants to claim that they are controlling them, that they're the people's army essentially, but the PDFs don't necessarily want to feel like they are being controlled by this entity that they don't necessarily identify with. So that's one issue. Then there's the issue of the relationship between the NUG and the EAOs or the EROs, as they're sometimes called, and it really depends on which one we're talking about. Again, not particularly my expertise, but I do know that the Kachin Independence Army and the Karen are much closer to the NUG and much more on board with the revolution than let's say the UWSA, the law state army, which is completely sat out and say, look, this is a Bamar issue. You guys talk amongst yourselves, and we are going to continue to live in sort of autonomy that we've etched out for ourselves. There's a book coming out by Andrew called Stalemate in June, Cornell University Press, really beautiful ethnography of life in law state and how they kind of like kept themselves from being absorbed by either the Chinese or the Myanmar over the years. And then the Shan of Dai are even more complicated, and my head just swims when I hear all these different alphabets, the CSS and the Ta'ang and the different kinds of things that they want. I think everyone is understandably suspicious of the Burma politics and always want to retain a sort of exit opportunity, or exit might not be the right word, a sort of not getting too deep and being in a situation where you get betrayed.
And in the past, you've done a lot of work on the role of Buddhist nationalism in the Burma supremacy. I'm just wondering what's going on now with Sangha, with the Wakadal, and the status of Buddhist nationalism.
Yeah, so some of the really popular monks have, like Peter Guseda, who's the head of probably the largest like network of giving and sort of like support groups in the country. He became quite famous in 2008 when he supported the Nargis reconstruction and deployed lots of his resources to go help that. But on the other hand, he's also gave this sermon after the genocide, basically saying to the Defense Service Academy, you didn't really do anything bad because you didn't kill a Buddhist. So he wrote the sort of story of, and I can't remember this particular sermon, in which the Buddhist king only slaughtered lots of people, but only really killed one because there was one Buddhist doing things. So this was interpreted as exonerating the military of its any karmic debt. So Thirugu is not the only monk in the country, of course. And the question is whether there are more like him or more. There are progressive monks as well, especially around Mandalay, doing really brave and courageous resistance work, especially in the first year since the coup. So it certainly is a mixed bag, but there are a number of right-wing monks who are quite happy to work with the military, and even in a sort of story that is a little bit shocking because the images of monks wielding guns. There's supposedly there are stories of monks distributing weapons to this thing called the Pusil T, which are the local offense forces for the like, paramilitary forces for the military state.
Great, please.
Holding the military officials accountable with the international community.
Sure. Yeah. So like, there was the question was, is there any potential to hold the generals accountable? There was a the ICJ case that was brought, and that Aung San Suu Kyi went and defended the country against the accusation of genocide. Occurred in 2019, 19, I believe, or 20. And at that point, was when the military essentially forced her to choose between human rights that she had espoused and just like decency, or this sort of right-wing Buddhist politics that they had kind of actualized when they committed the ethnic cleansing. And she said, hey, we won't outflank you to the right. I will happily defend our country against these brazen accusations. So there has been that. But even if that had, if the suit is victorious, that it's mostly a symbolic kind of consequence, kind of exposing the generally toothless nature of international law. So I would say that in terms of geopolitics, because Myanmar is very close to China and Russia, they have sort of cover for most of their actions and probably won't be to any.
Can you say anything about UNHCR in terms of the camps enough? They were saying yesterday they were asked the UN about this repatriation and all they said UNHCR is not bothered. Is UNHCR pretty much out of the picture in terms of camps, running camps?
So UNHCR and WFP it run the camps in terms of distribution of aid, and then the Bangladeshi government is running the camps in terms of security. Because the Bangladesh has not signed the Geneva Convention on Refugees, it means that UNHCR operates at the pleasure of the Bangladesh government. And so what kind of compromises they're willing to make in exchange for access to vulnerable populations that they do a lot of important things to serve is a set of questions that people have been asking for a long time. So there's a report even back in the 90s that talked about how much UNHCR was willing to essentially capitulate to Bangladesh's desire to, I don't know how to say it in French, but to refunnel the refugees back into Myanmar because Bangladesh didn't want them there anymore. On the other hand, their work is indispensable. So it's they're in a really tough position. So they are still active, but I don't think they're actively participating in that repatriation.
The fact that ARSA has basically taken up politically in the camps has the UN work with them.
This is a good question. I would imagine that the UN probably downplays. I know the UN has downplayed the prevalence of ARSA in the past because they won't work with them directly, and it is awkward to acknowledge the presence of ARSA because it undermines their own claims to be providing safety to refugees.
To the extent that UN agencies have programs within the camps, women's centers and youth centers and things like that, aren't you doesn't interfere with that? Or?
To the extent of my knowledge, they don't, but I don't know exactly.
So we have another question in the room, and we have two more. So I'm going to go one there, then to you, and then to the second one. This is from Seisman Khan. I assume you do not take Ayantar as a class in its own that is differentiated as with the Yalunites. Am I right?
Yeah. So the what some comments getting at here is the sort of question of like what constitutes a population group. And in Myanmar, you talk about a Lunyo as a sort of race, and Anyata would not see themselves as a Lunyo. And I've actually asked about that pretty directly. But it is a sort of identity. And so I wouldn't want to make Anyata equivalent to like Kachin or Rakhine, Rohingya, for instance. Anyata are Bamar, for the most part, I think would be the safest way to categorize them. It's more like the way that you could characterize different groups of let's say, white people in America, as wasps or blue bloods are different than yes, exactly, Okies or rednecks.
Great. So, yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit on how do you think ASEAN as an organization has reacted or responded in the last 2 years, if you have responded at all?
Yeah. So ASEAN has always taken a sort of non-interference approach. And so the idea that they would be really proactive in condemning the coup was realistic, but on the other hand, they have denied the military on a number of occasions the opportunity to represent the country in ASEAN fora. So on one hand, it's people in Myanmar feeling like ASEAN is letting them down, but on the other hand, they haven't been as bad as they were in the past.
So this is a very interesting question. Tony Waters, thank you. The U.S. Ambassador for War Crimes trials recently. U.S. Ambassador for War Crimes trials recently visited the Rohingya camps and talked about war crimes trials. No one is against international war crimes trials. What do you think about this initiative?
I think that like most initiatives of this nature have the opportunity to bring attention to something that is horrible things that have gone on, and but also have the potential to provide false hope to people who who believe that such initiatives will lead to a more substantive version of justice. Now, you could dispute that characterization and point to the trial of Milosevic or something as situations in which people are actually dragged to the Hague and thrown into prison. If there's political will on the part of this nebulous international community to do that is another question. I would only caution against providing false hope that this could be a meaningful solution for people who are looking for hope anywhere they can find hope.
And we have another question from Larry Austin, who says, sorry, I missed this. Did you say how many Rohingya have relocated to other countries outside of the region, Europe, North America?
Hi, Larry. Good question. I don't actually have numbers on a sort of repeat resettlement to like Western or global northern countries. I will say that the diaspora, if I'm not a demographer and I could be incorrect on these numbers, they're just estimates, but there's a surprising number of Rohingya in Greater Asia. So 300,000 and probably in Saudi Arabia, 300,000 in Pakistan, a really fascinating community that probably has the least assertive about its connection to Rohingya-ness, and sometimes describe themselves as like Muslims American, for instance, mostly because they had moved so long ago before Rohingya became an ethnonym that everyone would kind of identify with. And this is obviously a tricky question, because I think right-wing nationalists will say, oh, look, Rohingya wasn't used in the past, and that proves that Rohingya didn't exist. But to go back to my example of Mingla Tamyun and how parents wouldn't tell their kids that they are Rohingya, just like there's an active strategy of avoidance, doesn't mean that people weren't necessarily Rohingya, and that it doesn't make sense to identify with this ethnic when it can be dead. And of course, 1.5 million maybe Rohingya in Bangladesh, and then maybe 150,000, maybe 200,000 in Malaysia. I would say compared to all those numbers, repatriation in Europe and North America, I think is quite insubstantial. In the tens of thousands, perhaps, but I don't know for sure. I'm sorry.
The asylum process, though, is ongoing. Yes.
Yeah. So there's, I think, even just rewrote some of the asylum law in the U.S. and now people can sponsor refugees, which is kind of weird in the sense like there's like seems like a really inefficient way or a non-policy based way of doing it. But I think for people who are looking to get out, it is one thing they're excited about.
Any other questions? Well, I think we should just say thank you very much. It really was a very interesting and wide-ranging conversation. So thank you.
But if I could just add, I mean, I'm speaking a little bit off the cuff on some of these things that, if you heard something that you know is wrong, please do reach out to me and let me know that it was incorrect, because I would love to update my knowledge of the situation. Some of the things I spoke about today were clearly not in my direct wheelhouse, if I even have a wheelhouse.
Great, thank you. With that, we're gonna say goodbye.